St. Giles Files.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the St. Giles Files. So this week I'm going to talk about the context of objects and the citing of history. And as you might expect, I'm going to follow the same format as usual. So I'll discuss an object in St. Giles, then I'll discuss it in a wider St. Giles context, and then I'll push it out slightly further and discuss it in a world context. So the object that I'm going to discuss today is one of our communion tables. Now, it's what we call the Lorimer communion table, or what I call the Lorimer communion table, just to differentiate it. And it's currently located in the press aisle, so that is in the southeast corner of the cathedral. Now, it hasn't always been there, and perhaps I will give its whole history to give you a bit of context for the Lorimer table. So it was originally dedicated on Christmas Day of 1911, and it was placed under the east window of St. Giles. This was at a time when St. Giles was east-facing in what you might consider as an Anglican church, what was still called a holy table, not an altar, but more of maybe a traditional altar at the east end. This holy table was there. It was designed by Sir Robert Lorimer, the well-known architect, famous for the Thistle Chapel and the War Memorial at the castle. It was made by Nathaniel Grieve, who is again a famous craftsman, and it was probably the modeller Louis Ducas who provided some of the models for the figures. Louis Ducas again being one of Lorimer's craftsmen who was heavily involved with the construction of the models and some of the finer carvings in the Thistle Chapel. So that's the holy table originally. Now, in 1953, it was lengthened for the very special service of the Queen receiving the Honours of Scotland, or the Crown Jewels of Scotland. And I will post a picture of it, which many of you will have seen before, of the Queen receiving the Honours of Scotland in St. Giles. Now, when in the 1980s it was decided that the cathedral's orientation should change to a more central focus, you'll see the new white cube-shaped holy table is there because it was thought, and probably quite rightly, that the wooden Lorimer holy table, which we're discussing, wouldn't really have fit, with it being quite a long rectangular shape. I think it was probably right to have a more cube-shaped table to centre the focus of the cathedral on. So it's at that point then that in the 1980s, Lorimer holy table finds itself in the Preston Isle. And it would be a fair question to ask why the Preston Isle. There's no real reason as to why it's in the Preston Isle. The only main thing I can find is that the Preston Isle was designated as Chapel Royal for St. Giles, so it's theoretically the where royal worship would take place, and it also houses the seats for the royal chaplains, neither of which I think is really used in that situation. If the royal chaplains came, the chaplain's chairs probably would be moved into a more central location, and the communion table really isn't used that much in the Preston Isle. There's a smaller one that gets used for the services that take place in the Preston Isle, and it's fairly big still even in the Preston Isle. I mean, it does fit, but I suppose the question I'm asking today is the citing of objects, and why are objects where they are. Now, if we were talking purely utilitarian views of where things are in the cathedral, the holy table probably should have gone a while ago. It doesn't really fit in that Preston Isle, and it isn't used in that Preston Isle. However, if we are talking about Chapel Royal and the royal history attached with St. Giles Cathedral, then the Queen's chair is just off the edge of the Preston Isle. The previously mentioned chaplain's seats are in the Preston Isle. It's Chapel Royal, and so it makes sense to have an object with historical links to the royal occasions of St. Giles in the Preston Isle. Perhaps it's just for us to do a bit of a better job at explaining that, to make sure that the table does have its historical context and its citing made sense of. Right, so that's the holy table. Now I want to discuss a few more objects in St. Giles and widen the idea of historical citing and the context of objects out slightly. Where I'm going to start with this is where I finished last week with the Jenny Geddes stool. And this is an interesting one. I'm specifically talking about the memorial because we get a lot of people coming in and asking if that's where she threw it from. And I always think it'd be useful if we knew exactly, listen to last week's podcast for the debate on this. If she did exist, it'd be useful if we did know where she threw it from, just so we could put the stool in that place and say, yep, that's where she threw it from. But then I also think that might cause the usage problem. If it was right in the middle of the West End, having a huge memorial stool there isn't exactly going to be conducive for any type of service or performance because there's a big memorial there. And so we don't have the benefit of being a museum where the objects are the sole focus. We're a working building, and so we can't just stick a memorial in the spot that it is most relevant. If you've been to St Giles, you will notice that we have to put our memorials in the sites where things aren't happening, so people aren't walking in those areas. People can get to them, but it's not a high demand area, I suppose. But anyway, this is a bit of a moot point in this case because we don't know if Jenny Geddes existed, and we certainly don't know where she threw the stool from. But it raises the interesting point that people, to feel an extra layer of connection to the memorial or to the events that happened, want to know that question, is this where she threw it from? So that's an interesting point to raise. And it certainly connects to the next object that I will discuss, which is the John Knox pulpit. Now, a lot of people come in and expect the wooden pulpit, which is in the Murray aisle. So when you come into St Giles, you turn right past the desk and you carry on into what we call Writer's Corner. There is a wooden pulpit there, very Gothic, and it's quite imposing. A lot of people assume that is John Knox pulpit. Now, we had one particularly funny group of Americans who came in. It was quite a big group just as the service was about to start, so we asked them politely to either sit or to leave, but not to take photos. And they said, we just need to take photos of ourselves in the John Knox pulpit. And I said, sorry guys, that isn't actually here. We don't have John Knox pulpit here. And they said, that one there, we were told that's the pulpit. And I said, no, sorry, that's a 19th century pulpit. And they said, okay. And I said, okay, but please, again, just don't take photos. Anyway, I caught all of them, about a group of 30, switching around all taking photos in this pulpit. So it's interesting that regardless of the fact that I had told them that it wasn't, either they still believed it was or they were going to recreate the history anyway. Now, the point I'm making here is that somehow the history would be legitimised by there being the object in St Giles that they were looking for. I had told them actually that the National Museum has what we believe could have been John Knox pulpit. It's a pulpit of the right age, from the right area, of the right style. But again, that doesn't seem to be quite enough, that the object had to be in the area it was used for it to take on an extra level. And if they couldn't have that object, the pulpit, they would make do with another one and then maybe claim that the history was surrounding that object anyway. So I think that's another interesting use of history, it being a living history, that the object gains more legitimacy by being in its natural habitat. And I think this is similarly seen in St Giles with the grotesque that we tend to call E.T. This is a grotesque being a scary face, so it's a gargoyle but without the water spout. And we have one that is from the 12th century that is just in the wall next to the entrance of the shop. Again, I'll put a picture of it online. Now, it was found when they excavated the lower area, which used to be the cafe, in the 1980s. And it was subsequently stuck in the wall, as I've mentioned. Now, it could have been put in a museum. It could be sat in the National Museum of Scotland, and they could say this is a 12th century grotesque from St Giles Cathedral. But again, does it have more legitimacy being in St Giles and saying this used to be a part of this building and is from the 12th century, even though the 12th century building doesn't really exist anymore? Does it gain anything from being in St Giles? Not that I'm answering that question. I would think I lean to the side of saying yes, it does gain an inanimate quality by being in St Giles. A little bit more history, maybe. And so this will lead me on to two objects that have been moved around a bit more, either in St Giles or out of St Giles. The first one, returning to our friend John Knox. He has a statue in St Giles, and I say in because it hasn't always been in. When it was originally given to St Giles, it was in St Giles, and then they moved it out into the car park, also known as the old Kirk Graveyard, where we believe John Knox is buried. So it was thought that the historical siting of the statue was more important to be overlooking the grave itself, which I think you can understand, having the statue close to the burial spot as a memorial. But unfortunately, the weather had other ideas, and apparently the statue was showing the signs of weathering, and so it was decided to move it back into the cathedral. Now, there are lots of people with very strong opinions on where the statue should be located, which I always find odd, especially for a statue of a man who probably wouldn't have wanted a statue to himself, but there we go. So it does raise the question of where the statue should be, and some people might suggest that we've compromised our historical siting, overlooking the grave, for the care of the object itself. There's no point of having a worn-out statue that's in the right place, rather have a statue that still exists that's slightly in the wrong place, although I would argue that being inside the cathedral isn't really the wrong place for a statue of John Knox, but there we go. But one object that the cathedral was the wrong place for was a screen. Now, when I say screen, I don't mean a plastic screen, something we've, I suppose, come a little bit more used to in the recent weeks. I mean a big wooden screen, and it's not a thick, opaque screen, it's quite an ornate screen. It came from a time when the cathedral was slightly more separated, and in the 1980s there was a bit of a push to clear the cathedral and make it one big space with a focus on the centre, as I mentioned earlier. So this screen separated the Murray aisle off into its own smaller chapel. So it was decided the screen needed to be removed, and St Giles didn't have a spot for it, didn't have a use for it, but it obviously still had historical value. So you will now find the screen in the National Museum of Scotland. And I think I'll use this screen to push out the discussion a bit wider. And I'll discuss the screen relatively to the Lorimer table, which we started with. So the screen itself was surplus to requirements in its position at that time. Now, that was very similar to the Holy Table. It was earmarked to be moved. The difference being, I suppose, in this scenario is, for those that have seen the screen, and again, I'll get a little picture of it online, it's huge. So where the Holy Table could be moved to a different spot, the screen probably couldn't be moved. And on top of that, it doesn't have any St Giles specific history, whereas the Holy Table has events that have occurred around it, and it can be sited in a different part of the cathedral and still maintain its relevance. The relevance of the screen is purely its aesthetic and its architectural significance that marks a point in Scottish styles. So it proves very illustrative in the museum in the church architecture section, but it wouldn't prove as useful or as informative in St Giles anymore. So the point I'm making is that if an object loses its relevancy or context in its original building, if it has a museum context, in this case architectural, then we should be happy to move it into a museum to have its new context realised and its historic siting making more sense. I think perhaps a good way to illustrate this is, again, going to the National Museum of Scotland. They have a lot of torture equipment in one area, the guillotine, thumb screws, things of that sort. And I think the museum is there to maybe remove the dangerous context of these. So we don't necessarily need to go into the room where these devices were used on people to have them grounded in history. Not even to mention the fact that the room where they were used, or rooms or setting in which they were used, might not even exist anyway. But the point being that we might have to remove potentially unpleasant objects from unpleasant surroundings. Although, to play Kira or devil's advocate to my own point, we shouldn't try and edit history or remove the gravitas of an object just because we find its surroundings unpleasant. But perhaps if we find the surroundings dangerous, and whether that be physically, mentally, politically dangerous, we might consider a more viable place of displaying an object. Now then, having said all that, do we lose anything by removing an object from its context? The question here I'm asking is that I posed earlier on is the living history element. So to do this, I'm going to use the Battle of Bannockburn. For those of you that don't know, the Battle of Bannockburn was an English versus Scottish conflict just outside Stirling, which the Scots ended up winning. Now, the interesting thing about Bannockburn is we know roughly where it took place. We don't know exactly where it took place. Also, they told me at the Bannockburn Centre. But what I'm interested in is that the centre could be anywhere. So essentially what they have in the centre, they do have some objects, but the centre is largely based on an interactive experience, which is quite a new way, I suppose, of displaying this history. It's a very new centre. But I do think it gains something and it becomes more immediate when they tell you some of the things that happened, and without giving anything away, they let you have a bit of a go at recreating history. There is something about walking out into that area and seeing the sites that they tell you about, and then also seeing Stirling Castle and feeling that history in a way that maybe you might not do in a museum. And without pulling at this thread too much, maybe gives you a more bottom-up history. In a museum, I think it's very easy to have a top-down, big man approach of, oh, someone used this, great. Maybe in the field standing there, you feel more what the ordinary person stood looking up at the castle and thinking, oh, we've got to fight this battle tomorrow, brilliant. So the sighting in Bannockburn's case, well, it doesn't matter for the content of the centre itself. I think it does matter for what you do with that content in the immediate aftermath of having been to the centre. So maybe to understand the history slightly better, it does help if we can cite objects, experiences as close as possible to where that history happened, because people feel like they are experiencing 1%, 10% of the history itself. And I think that's maybe the summary of the question that I'm asking today. Is historical citing and context important? And perhaps my answer to this question is yes, so long as it makes sense. If you can put something where it happened or where it was from in a safe and sensible and also in a well-interpreted manner, then of course you're going to. But if it can't be, or if that's lost, or if it's dangerous, then a museum context is really useful and can be better in certain circumstances where interpretation maybe can't provide what we would need for visitors to do so. Right, I think that'll do for this week. If you do have any thoughts or comments on anything I've said, do let me know. It might end up being that I do one episode on people's thoughts and comments on any and all of the episodes, so do let me know. Part of the reason that I am doing this on my own is some staff have been furloughed at St Giles, but St Giles is doing a great job of topping their salary up, so everyone is still being paid 100% of their salary at St Giles. But the only way we can do that is by donations. And at the moment, given that people can't come into St Giles, we're getting very few of them. Please, 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 if you enjoyed the podcast, do give it a small donation if you can. Thanks. Bye-bye.